The morning sun rose over the small village of Daryapur like it always did, slow, golden and indifferent, its light spilling over mud houses and dusty paths where children ran barefoot chasing the same dreams their parents once buried in silence. The air smelled of smoke and soil and something old, something tired, and in that air lived a young girl named Ayesha whose eyes always searched the sky as if she could find something beyond it. Ayesha's house stood near the end of the narrow street beside the old well that never ran dry. Her father was a mason, his hands rough from years of carrying stones that never built his own home. Her mother stitched clothes for the richer families in town. Their small world spun around survival and silence, and Ayesha was meant to follow that same path. Marry early, bear children, cook, clean, repeat. But there was something different about her. She was restless, her mind sharp, her heart wild. She wanted more than the dust, she wanted meaning. Every day she walked to the small government school 2 kilometers away, carrying her torn notebook pressed to her chest. The boys laughed at her, the neighbors whispered that a girl walking alone invited shame. Her mother begged her to stay home, but Ayesha's words were always the same: one day I'll make you proud. And her mother would sigh, knowing pride was a luxury they could not afford. Inside the classroom she sat in the front row, her eyes wide, absorbing every word like it was gold. She loved stories, especially about those who fought impossible battles. She believed that books were windows and through them she could breathe. Her teacher, Miss Fareeda, noticed her hunger for learning and once told her, Ayesha, you have fire in your eyes, keep it alive. The world will try to put it out, but don't let them. And Ayesha never forgot those words. At home nights were long and the walls thin. Her parents fought over money, over the price of rice, over debts that never ended. Her father's anger grew with every unpaid bill, and sometimes his silence was even heavier than his voice. Ayesha would lie awake staring at the cracks on the ceiling, listening to her mother's muffled sobs and wondering if dreams were meant to hurt. One afternoon her father came home earlier than usual, his face dark, his voice sharp. He told her the decision had been made. A proposal had come from a wealthy family in the next village. The man was older, but he had land and money. Her father said it was a blessing from God. Ayesha froze, the words sank into her chest like stones. She was only 16. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear. She begged her mother to stop it, but her mother's eyes said what her lips could not: we have no choice. That night Ayesha sat outside under the old neem tree. The wind was warm, the stars distant. She thought of Miss Fareeda's words about fire, and she whispered to herself, I will not burn for someone else's comfort, I will burn for my own light. And in that moment a decision was born. 2 nights later she packed a small cloth bag, a few clothes, her notebook, and a little money her mother had secretly pressed into her hand without a word, and before dawn she left the village, her heart pounding, her eyes wet but her feet unshaken. The road to the city was long and cruel. The bus smelled of sweat and dust. She sat by the window watching fields fade into factories, rivers turn into drains, and people become crowds. The city was loud, alive and uncaring. She stepped off the bus into chaos, horns shouting, faces rushing. She felt invisible and yet free. The first few weeks were hell. She found shelter in a small hostel for working girls run by an old woman named Shama, who asked no questions but saw everything. Ayesha lied that she was looking for work, her voice trembling but determined. She began washing dishes at a tea stall in Sadar Market, earning barely enough for food, yet she never complained. At night she would read her old notebook, writing stories by candlelight, words that helped her survive. One day a customer left behind a torn newspaper on the table. The headline spoke of a scholarship program for underprivileged girls. Ayesha's heart skipped. She knew this was her chance, but she needed proof of education, certificates, identity, things she didn't have. So she went back to Miss Fareeda's school. After months of absence, the teacher was shocked to see her alive, and even more so to hear her story. She hugged Ayesha tight and said, you have more courage than all the men I've ever known. Miss Fareeda helped her apply. She wrote a letter saying, this girl is the kind of light our world needs, and by some miracle Ayesha was selected. The scholarship covered her tuition and hostel. She began studying at a small college in the city. Days blurred into nights filled with work, study, exhaustion and hope. She faced ridicule from classmates who mocked her accent, her clothes, her silence, but she endured. In the evenings she worked at a textile shop folding fabrics under fluorescent lights, her fingers numb, her back aching, but every rupee she saved reminded her that she was building her own destiny. She became friends with another girl, Samira, who was bold, talkative and full of dreams. They would sit on the hostel rooftop eating biscuits and talking about a world where women could walk without fear, where choices were not a crime. Then one evening as Ayesha walked home through a narrow alley, a group of men followed her, their laughter sharp like knives. She kept walking faster, her heart racing. She reached the main road, breathless, safe, but shaking. She realized that courage wasn't just about leaving her village, it was about surviving every day in a world that refused to see her strength. Months passed. She excelled in her studies. She wrote essays about women's rights, about education, about freedom. Her words began to attract attention. Her professor encouraged her to publish them, and soon her article appeared in a local newspaper under the title "Let Her Learn." The response was overwhelming. Some praised her, others cursed her, but she didn't care. Her voice was finally out there. Back in Daryapur, her father read that article by accident. A neighbor had shown him. He didn't speak much, but that night he sat in silence, staring at the lamp flame, his hands trembling. He whispered her name, as if calling back the child he had lost to his own fear. Meanwhile, Ayesha's life in the city was changing. She got a part-time job at an NGO working for women's education. She began visiting rural areas, speaking to girls who reminded her of herself. She told them, "Your voice matters, your dreams matter, even when no one listens, keep speaking." But life has a way of testing even the strongest spirits. One night a fire broke out in her hostel building. Chaos, screams, smoke. She ran through the flames, helping others escape. She carried a girl out just before the roof collapsed. The fire took everything: her clothes, her books, her memories, but not her will. When asked how she managed, she said, "I've been running through fire my whole life. This one just had flames." The incident caught media attention. She became known as the girl who saved others, and suddenly people wanted to know her story. She was invited to speak at a youth conference, her first time on a real stage. Her hands trembled as she faced the crowd. She looked at hundreds of faces and said, "I was told I could not study. I was told I was too small, too poor, too female, but here I am, not because I'm brave, but because I refused to die before living." The applause was thunderous, but Ayesha's eyes filled with tears. She knew this was not the end, it was just the beginning. The applause still echoed in Ayesha's ears long after the lights faded. She stood backstage, her chest heavy, not with pride but disbelief. For the first time she felt seen. The same world that once told her to stay silent now asked her to speak. Her story began to spread: small news clips, social media posts, people calling her a hero, but she didn't feel like one. She was just a girl who had refused to bow to fear. Days turned into weeks. She was invited to speak at schools and events. She traveled to towns she had never heard of. Each place had girls who looked at her with wide eyes as if she was proof that they too could dream. She told them, "Courage is not born in comfort, it grows in pain," and each time she spoke she felt her own scars heal a little more. But the higher she rose, the more the weight of her past began to pull her back. She thought often of her parents, of the house she had left behind. She wondered if they still spoke her name or had erased it completely. Sometimes she dreamt of her mother's hands stitching clothes late into the night and woke with tears on her face. One evening she received a letter written in her father's shaky handwriting. It said simply, "Come home, your mother is sick." Her hands trembled as she held it. All the noise of the city faded into silence. She packed her bag once again, not as a runaway this time, but as a woman returning to the ashes of her past. The road to Daryapur felt shorter this time, maybe because she was no longer a frightened girl. She arrived at dusk. The village looked the same, yet smaller. Her heart pounded as she walked through the narrow streets. People stared, whispering her name. She stopped in front of her house, the same cracked walls, the same smell of smoke. When she entered, her mother lay on the charpoy, frail but smiling, her eyes bright with pride. "You came," her mother whispered. Ayesha knelt beside her, tears streaming. Her mother touched her face and said, "I always knew you'd fly, even when your wings were broken." Her father stood in the corner, silent, unable to meet her eyes. She turned to him and said, "Baba, I didn't leave you, I left the cage." He nodded slowly, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. "I know," he said softly, "I was the one who built it." They talked long into the night, stories, apologies, silences that finally found words. And when her mother passed a few weeks later, Ayesha did not cry. She stood strong, knowing that her mother's soul had finally seen peace. After the funeral, she stayed in the village for some time, helping the local school, arranging books, teaching little girls who gathered around her like stars. One day an old man came to her house with his granddaughter. He said, "My son wanted her to marry early, but she said she wants to study like you. I came to ask if you can teach her." Ayesha smiled. This was how revolutions began, not with noise but with small, quiet acts of defiance. Back in the city, her story continued to grow. She became a face for education campaigns. Documentaries were made. People wanted to photograph her, speak with her, but she always insisted it wasn't about her, it was about the millions who never got a chance to speak. Despite the fame, she lived simply, a small rented room, books stacked high, a window that looked out onto the noisy street. Sometimes she would sit there for hours watching people pass by, wondering how many of them carried untold stories inside them. Then came an invitation that would change everything. She was asked to speak at an international conference in Islamabad. Leaders, activists, educators from around the world would attend. She hesitated, thinking of how far she had come and how far she still felt from the world's big stages. But her mentor, Miss Fareeda, told her, "Ayesha, your story belongs there. Your pain has become your power." The night before her flight, she couldn't sleep. She thought of the 16-year-old girl who had run away with nothing but a torn notebook. She whispered to that memory, "Thank you for not giving up." The next day she stood on the grand stage, lights, bright faces, expectant. Her hands shook, but her voice was steady. She began by saying, "I am not here because I am brave. I am here because I was afraid every single day, but I walked anyway because fear is not the end, it's just the beginning of courage." She spoke of the fire of her childhood, the chains of tradition, the night she ran, the battles she fought. She spoke not in anger but in grace. When she finished, the audience rose in silence before applause erupted, filling the hall like thunder. After the speech, journalists surrounded her. One asked, "What message do you have for the young girls of this country?" Ayesha looked into the camera and said, "Tell them their worth is not measured by what the world allows them to do, but by what they dare to dream. Tell them no one gives freedom. You take it with both hands and never let go." Her words spread like wildfire online. People across the nation shared her video. The girl from Daryapur had become a symbol of strength, a living reminder that courage grows in the darkest soil. But even as success embraced her, Ayesha knew her journey was not over. She wanted to build something lasting. She started her own foundation, Umeed, meaning hope. Its mission simple: to educate and empower rural girls. She traveled from village to village, speaking, teaching, fundraising. With every donation she built classrooms, libraries, futures. She returned again and again to the same kind of villages that once trapped her, now opening their doors for the daughters who followed. Years passed, seasons changed, her hair grew longer, her name grew louder, yet she never lost that fire. She still woke before dawn, still carried the same torn notebook in her bag as a reminder of where it all began. Then one evening, as she sat on the rooftop of the new school she built, she watched a group of girls laughing, running across the courtyard, their voices echoing into the golden sunset, and she smiled softly, remembering the girl she once was, barefoot and scared but unbroken. Samira, her old friend from college, walked up beside her and said, "You did it, Ayesha, you changed everything." Ayesha shook her head and said, "No, Samira, they changed everything. They chose to believe." Later that night, when the stars appeared, she spoke to the sky again like she used to back in her village. "I made it," she whispered, "but more importantly, I made a way for others to come too." As time moved on, her name became known far beyond her borders. Universities invited her, organizations honored her, but she never chased awards. Her heart belonged to the simple classrooms filled with chalk, dust, and laughter. Her favorite sound was the murmur of little girls reading out loud, stumbling over words but refusing to stop. One day, while visiting a small town, she met a little girl who tugged at her dupatta and said, "Appa, I want to be like you when I grow up." Ayesha smiled, knelt down, and said, "No, little one, be more, be everything they told you not to be." Years later, an international magazine wrote an article calling her the woman who overcame everything. She read it quietly and smiled because she knew the truth: she hadn't overcome everything, she had learned to live with the pain and turn it into purpose, and that was enough. Her journey from a forgotten village to the world stage was not written in comfort but carved in scars. Every bruise, every tear, every loss had become a brick in the foundation of something unshakable. She had not just changed her life, she had changed the story for countless others. On her last visit to Daryapur, she walked past the old neem tree where she once sat in the dark as a frightened girl. The wind rustled the leaves as if whispering, "Welcome back." She placed her hand on the bark and closed her eyes, feeling the earth beneath her feet. She whispered, "Thank you for holding me when I had nothing else." Children ran past, laughing, chasing kites across the same sky that once watched her escape, and for a moment she saw herself among them, not as a hero, not as a name in the papers, but simply as a girl who dared to dream. And that night, when the village slept, Ayesha sat by the window looking at the stars and spoke softly to the unseen girl inside her chest, the one who still trembled and hoped. She said, "We did it. We became what we needed when we were young and afraid. We became our own answer." The wind carried her words into the night, through fields, through cities, through hearts of those who would one day rise because of her light. And though time would eventually fade her name, the fire she lit, would never die. Because some stories are not written on paper, they are written in the souls of those who refuse to give up. Ayesha's story was one of them, a story of a woman who walked through fire and built a path for others to follow, a woman who against all odds refused to surrender. And so her legacy lived not in monuments or medals but in every girl who picked up a book, every mother who let her daughter dream, every man who finally listened, and in that quiet revolution born of pain and love and defiance, Ayesha's spirit burned eternal.